welcome to Talk It Out with me. So today I have a guest, Danny Haiphong. He's a journalist based in New York. So hi Danny, how are you?
Hi, Jing. It's good to be with you.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit to our audiences?
Sure. So, my name is Danny Haiphong, and I am a contributing editor to the Black Agenda Report. And I also am on the organizing committee for No Cold War and do peace work and solidarity work with Black Alliance for Peace.
Like you're half Asian, right? Like how do you see this racism towards Asian in America?
Well, it's a long history. I mean, it's in my personal history, as you said. And growing up, it wasn't uncommon for me to experience not I have not been murdered, but I have been assaulted in my life for my race, living in the United States, growing up in the Boston area, no stranger to racism, a city that was one of the last to desegregate its schools in 1974. So racism is a huge part of culture in the United States, a huge part of politics in the United States. Dare I say it's formative in the sense that the United States was formed on the basis of race, that uh, the slave trade and the colonization of indigenous lands, and which required a lot of violence toward indigenous peoples, helped really shape what the United States is at the moment. And so for me, while it isn't new in my personal life, I think it's important that we see these attacks not as some kind of individual phenomenon and just about, I think it can be too simplistic to see it as just hate, right? Because I think racism is always about political interests and economic interests. And if we trace the origins of where this yellow peril racism comes from, this demonization of the quote unquote other, this time being people of East Asian and people of Asian descent, we can trace it back to the United States' participation in the Opium Wars during the mid 20th century. We can trace it back to the United States' racialized and downright racist immigration laws toward Chinese laborers and then Korean laborers as well as Japanese laborers, the mass internment of Japanese residents in the United States during World War II, hundreds of thousands put into literal concentration camps, and also the long history of U.S. foreign policy, whether it's the occupation of the Philippines in the late 19th century into the middle of the 20th century, a nearly 5 decade long occupation, invasion of Korea, the invasion of Vietnam. All of this caused millions of casualties. Millions of people in these regions were killed by U.S. forces. And in order to make that palatable, the United States and its military and political leaders had to create a framework from which this could be acceptable. And that was by dehumanizing the victims, by rendering them less than human. And that's where all of this racism comes from. When people, these violent attacks, when they do them, it's not just some sort of ingrained hate. It is about a long history that's been injected into the culture, which creates these problems. And when we think about it now in the contemporary period, in the current period, we have to factor in the US's aggressive posture toward China, which has been fueled by coronavirus, COVID-19 conspiracies, the scapegoating of China and people of Asian descent as being blamed, right? People, Chinese people and people from the region have been blamed for this virus in a totally racist manner. And that, along with all of the aggressive policies and the corporate media, headline after headline, people like Tony Blinken, before him, Mike Pompeo, statement after statement, aggressively painting China as out of the ordinary and as literally coming after the American people's lunch, right? That's really the narrative, is China's coming after American values. It's coming after American interests. And this has led to a disastrous spike in a disastrous dip, I should say, in US public opinion toward China, that we can't dis just dismiss that when we think about these kind of violent acts. It really is a kind of total picture that has been painted for the people of the United States to think that what is the right thing to do is to scapegoat and demonize China, demonize the people of the region. And that has led, I believe, to the proliferation of this kind of violence.
I remember I watched some of your earlier interviews, and you talk about when you were a kid, you experienced racism attacks, people using slurs, calling you. But when you grow up, do you also have to deal with this racism all the time? Do you see a change of this racism towards Asians?
You know, for me, being a multiracial person, it can be quite an interesting thing to navigate. Race really does, and this, I think, surprises a lot of people who live outside of the United States. Race really does create a very chaotic kind of way of relating to people. It always depends for me at this point in my life. But when I was younger, I looked a little different. My hair was a little different. I didn't wear glasses. There was a kind of different look that I had, and it was a lot easier, especially for kids and even young adults and adults, to sort of associate me with these images, what I call images of war, right? Image propaganda of war. The notion that people from East Asia, whether it's Vietnam or Korea or China, wherever, are kind of merely projections of this superiority, right? That people from this particular region are inferior because the United States has projected its military and economic superiority there. But now it's tough because, but I do still experience it. I mean, when I got back from China, I was very troubled with the way that people reacted, not only to my trip, but also to the fact that it was right before COVID-19 really took off anywhere else, or at least was known, because I think it had been going around. But the first outbreak in Wuhan was just happening as I was coming back. And the influence of the media, the way that the media was covering it, attacking China as authoritarian, quote unquote, saying, talking about giving all of these kind of racist innuendos about bats and the diets of Chinese people, etc., being possibly a root cause of why this happened. All of that influenced a lot of people around me, and they asked me questions about this and almost assumed that myself and people in China were participating in almost like these backwards and savage kind of practices. And it was really offensive. So it still does happen. I mean, it's still just part, and it's part of the culture, and it happens in subtle ways too. It's not just overt, a name call, right? It's not just a racist slur, but it's also the way that people treat you. Do they see you as more docile? Do they not respect your ideas? It happens even in political work all the time, even in activist work, even when you're doing journalism, right? Do they respect your ideas? Do they see you as an authoritative figure? Do they see you as younger than you really are, right? A lot of these have, I think, racial connotations that I experience up until this day.
They keep saying, criticizing Chinese officials, wolf warrior diplomacy, because they see the Chinese diplomats start to willing to confront and being a little aggressive towards them. When many people criticizing Chinese spokesmen are being aggressive, this wolf warrior diplomacy, I'm wondering, how do you see this wolf warrior diplomacy?
The United States doesn't like to be stood up to. The United States sees itself as a hegemonic power, as a unilateral force, and as it treats the international order and the majority of nations around the world as inferiors. So when China presents a posture that demands equality, that is what really offends US officials. And I think it's important to understand wolf warrior diplomacy, this insult that's hurled at China as a manifestation of an attempt to maintain this kind of superiority complex. It's used in this way to slander the foreign ministry of China, to slander all of its representatives as they being the ones who are disinterested in diplomacy. But we've seen time and time again that actually the United States comes to the table in Alaska at Anchorage and immediately demands that China change its ways through all of these baseless accusations rather than showing true respect, coming to the table with needs, with points of cooperation. And it's important to challenge this wolf warrior diplomacy talk because it does also have racist connotations because it isn't used against other countries that the US allies with. First of all, we've seen how, for example, Japanese officials are they kind of bow to the United States. China won't do that. China sits at the table equally with the United States. Europe kind of just goes along with whatever the United States does in general. And so there also isn't the same kind of adversarial framing toward Europe. But with China, because China demands equality, and also there is all of this new Cold War hysteria and a long history of racism in the United States, China gets the wolf warrior diplomacy label.
I'm wondering, how do you see this Alaska meeting?
It was the first meeting between the US and China during the Biden administration, but the Biden administration has made some curious choices leading up to the meeting. It had met with allies of the United States first, and more importantly, had met with the Quad Alliance first, sending a pretty stark message to China that it was actually privileging a Trump era alliance that was revived under Donald Trump to be very aggressive toward China and to continue this long pattern in US politics where China is demonized, where China is targeted and vilified. Tony Blinken, as Secretary of State representing it, completely broke with diplomatic protocol. Diplomacy is about bringing your needs to the table and treating your partner as equals. It is not about coming in as if you are superior. And that's exactly what the United States side did. It immediately talked about how China has all of these problems that are of a concern to the United States, and that the US was going to make sure that these problems would be fixed. That's not how you treat another country that you're meeting with. And it's not how the US has treated closed door meetings with, let's say, India, where Prime Minister Modi met privately with Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, for example. So there is just a lot of double standards here. But I think what came out of it was the positive is that the two sides met. But the overall consequences, I think, are that, especially on the China side, it seems pretty clear that relations with, let's say, Russia are going to be paramount, and Chinese officials were meeting with Russian officials, as of the last 24 to 48 hours, because the United States is not showing an interest in cooperation, but rather continuing this pattern of flexing its muscles and painting China as an adversary. And I think that this is just a pattern that must be challenged. It's a policy that must be challenged because it's very dangerous, and it is one that most of humanity doesn't want, even though in the United States there has been a bigger and bigger appetite for it.
Earlier, you told me that you're really glad to see Yang Jiechi dare to confront Blinken, saying, well, you have no qualifications to criticize China like that. So you're American. Why are you waiting to see Chinese diplomats willing to confront American diplomats?
Well, I think that there is a real shift happening in global politics right now, right? The United States is on the decline, and it's on the decline for very good reasons, because the United States does not offer uh, the basic human rights and needs to people living in the United States. It has a large military apparatus that is really holding back progress for so many nations and people all around the world, but yet it boasts of itself as the most exceptional civilization that has ever really came to be. And all of this, given that the United States also has this long history of racism, both internationally and domestically. So all of these problems are completely ignored by official society, by policymakers, by those who really have power. And it is high time that the world and international affairs, global politics become more equal, become more, as China and Russia and others have been spearheading, more multipolar, that there is no longer this unipolar, unilateral hegemony exercised by the United States, because it hasn't brought the world anything but pain. It hasn't brought the world anything but crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, as well as social crises all across the board in any region of the world. And I think it's high time that this global order, where the United States is at the top, is transformed into a more equal, a more multipolar, a more participatory, and dare I say, democratic. China is never framed as democratic, neither is Russia and a lot of other countries in the global south. But as they continue to rise into global leadership, it is almost inevitable that the world order becomes more democratic, because it demands that countries work together rather than serve the interests of one or just a small group of nations. So I think that's why it's so inspiring and it's so important for these kind of developments to happen. Not because we want to see conflict. No, we want to see cooperation. Peace activists want to see countries working cooperatively.
About it, you just mentioned your trip to China at the end of 2019, right? Just right before the outbreak at the beginning of 2020. So I'm wondering, how do you feel about your trip to China, by the way?
Oh, it was one, I mean, I'll be honest, it was maybe the best experience of my life, but definitely one of the best experiences. And it's so funny when I talk about it like this, because I am so enthusiastic about it. And immediately what people say, especially online, is, oh, was the Communist Party of China taking you around and giving you all these deals? It's like, no, this was just a delegation organized completely by people in the United States and Britain. When I was there, to be able to experience and see the progress, right? To be able to get through in my head what it's like to go to cities. Like, I was in Beijing, then we went to Xi'an, then we went to Danhuang, and then we went to Urumqi in Xinjiang, and to get through my head just the 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 speed of development and how the development is people centered, right? Like, there is this massive investment in transportation, in renewable energy, high speed rail, which China's new 5-year plan invests 460 billion more US dollars in high speed rail, right? It's like you see that everywhere. You see the electric cars in the street, which makes even busy Beijing streets kind of quiet, right? Like, it was, to be in New York City where everything is diesel and the trains are slow, and the trains can be 50 years old without being repaired at some points, and then to go to Beijing and Xi'an and see architecture, to see development, most of which is 10, 20 years old, 30 years old, to see how rapidly it's developed, to see the standard of living of people be so high in a country that, just 70 years ago and even just 40 years ago was really not an industrial country at all. It was majority rural. It was nearly 100% countryside in a lot of ways in terms of where people lived and where they worked. And so to see how that has changed so much to the benefit of people, to see how truly satisfied a lot of people are with the trajectory of the country. And by gosh, people in China are very opinionated. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of satisfaction with the overall trajectory in how people are being treated and the needs that are being met. and the balance, right? Being able to talk a lot about the balance of what it's like in this global situation, a domestic situation, which, with all the progress, still very complicated. It's complex, right? Trying to build a modern socialist country is not a tea party. It is difficult work in a very hostile situation. So to be able to see all that, to be able to ride 2 high-speed rails was incredible, right? To get 700, 800 kilometers in a matter of hours, 3.5 hours. It's unheard of here in the United States. So I was very encouraged by that. I was encouraged to meet just people who are so interested in talking about this kind of progress, and also talking about, how do we build better relations? How do we build better ties? How do we make this about peace and make it so we can live as humanity, more days than not, by addressing climate change and by de-escalating military tensions. It was great to see a country that is oriented in that direction, because where I sit in the United States, it's the opposite. The United States is investing more and more and more in war. It's investing more in police and prisons and less in schools and housing and jobs, right? Going in a different direction. And so to see a country which is rising so fast, which has come from such an impoverished, that was another thing that struck me. Confidence. People are confident. People are standing tall. I think what happened in Alaska is just part of a larger trend. China will not be bullied. And I think that's a very inspiring thing to see. More people to people exchanges like this are really important for people in the United States to see that China is not the boogeyman. It is not the enemy. Chinese people and the Chinese government are not our enemies. They are really partners in trying to solve these very difficult questions, these very complex questions of how do we wage peace? How do we wage a real war on poverty and not on people and nations? And how do we ensure that the planet is livable? And China is one of the few countries, right? There's only a host of countries where these issues are at the forefront of their agenda. And so it was really great to see that in person, to just experience the culture, the food, and also see the development. It's so important that people witness that, because it normalizes this idea that the United States and what it says about other countries, especially China, is not rooted in fact. It's rooted in interests.
So I'm wondering, after you go back to New York, was there any moment that you were like, oh crap, I was just there like a few weeks ago? Or were there any moment you feel like, oh, probably China probably won't make it? Or any doubts? Do you have any doubts after you went back to New York?
Actually, what's really funny, this is a really good question, because it's one that I don't think I'll ever forget, that this experience of coming back after 2.5 weeks in China, where, I think there was some small rumbling, something was going around, didn't know what it was. But once I came back, it was known, human to human transmission. This may be, the genome was sent to the WHO, I think the day I came back. I think it was like January 11th or something like that. So it was intense. And I had a friend in Wuhan, who I saw. I didn't doubt China and its pandemic response. I didn't know how it was going to go, because I was still learning, right? And I think also China was learning. This pandemic was new, and learning really how to take care of it, and kind of trying things out. But I was more worried. I was really worried about the United States, actually. One, I was already noticing how the virus was being politicized in the media, to the point where I was being asked all the time by coworkers about whether I was scared that I got it, whether, they were kind of scared of me. I think people were scared of me because I was just there. Then there was all of the misinformation, right, about where the virus came from. And the bat soup thing blew my mind. And the wet market, right? The wet markets and the bats that Chinese people eat. That was the narrative. And it was so racist because it was rooted in nothing but Foreign Policy magazine and CNN and all this innuendo from Westerners, right? Westerners who know nothing about China talking about how backward Chinese people are. And I was really worried about the effect of that because it always came with this: China's an authoritarian country. Watch what it does. It's going to squash liberties. It's going to do bad things to its people, which means we can't learn anything from what China does economically. So I was worried about what was going to happen here. Unfortunately, I was a little vindicated in the sense that the response here was an unmitigated disaster, and we've seen the results, right? More than 500,000 deaths, and an economy, a capitalist economy, which is in depression, and honestly, with no real forecasts as to when that will end. So, yeah, my experience with coming back from China, then hearing all of the media headlines and news reporting on China's pandemic response got me really worried about how is the United States going to respond to this, and how is it going to affect us when we have to really um, band together and figure this out. Turns out we didn't do any banding together in the United States. We all felt like we were on our island waiting for government officials to give us all kinds of different information. The infodemic is still going on here, and we did not learn the lessons that we needed to learn from the first experience, which China was. It was the first experience with COVID-19. It is really the standard bearer of what it meant to respond to COVID-19. And those countries that learned from China did very well. Those countries that didn't, they have suffered. And the people more so have suffered. The rich have gotten richer, but the people and ordinary people have really bared the brunt of it. So yeah, that was my experience. Was no doubts. I mean, I didn't have doubts in China. I knew it was going to be a struggle, and it was obvious. My friend in Wuhan was WeChatting me saying, this is a hard time. It's hard to be in lockdown. It's hard to live a completely different lifestyle, right? Not seeing people, but I was not worried about whether people's needs or interests would be met. And nothing about China's response has made me question that up until this day.
I think you being very vocal, speaking up about spreading positive information, real information coming out from China. I'm wondering, do you feel like you're the lonely voice in the general society in America?
Well, it is quite lonely. In the United States in particular, there is a shortage of people willing to defend China, and it's a consequence of this new Cold War that the United States has been waging for not just the last year, not just 2020 into this year, but it's been nearly a decade of gradual escalations from the pivot to Asia that the Obama administration declared until now, to the point where the national security strategy and public opinion is really shaped by how the United States addresses national security, is all about containing China and also addressing what it sees now as a increasingly adversarial Russia. There is a barrage of anti-China messaging, misinformation. That kind of messaging has such a huge influence on people in the United States. And that's why we have Gallup polls saying that 80% view China unfavorably. It's because of that. And so, yes, it can be quite lonely, but it is important to be lonely, to keep going, because one thing about the United States that I have learned in, I don't know, it's been eight to 10 years of being involved in politics, activism, and journalism, it's that you have to take what the United States says and does very seriously. You cannot you cannot wait until things get bad, right? The United States, people in the United States waited and watched as it invaded Libya in 2011, waited and watched as the United States staged coup after coup after coup under Obama, hoping that it would just change on its own. People in the United States have waited a long time for things to get better economically, but they just keep getting worse. You have to take that very seriously and speak up now, because the United States and those who make policy, those who are in power, they're not waiting. They are expressing their interests, and they're hoping that people will go along with it, that they'll absorb the misinformation. My lonely voice as one, I think, of many more who will come as more and more people realize, especially with this rise of anti-Asian violence, just how consequential and how damaging souring relations between the US and China, and the US's leading role in creating this souring relationship really is for all of humanity.